The prank that changed everything. A story of a terrible mistake, an unexpected forgiveness, and the lives that were never the same after. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 4:32. They thought it would be funny. That is the sentence that Bryce Holden and Damon Fitch would repeat to themselves, separately in the weeks and months that followed. Not as an excuse, because there was no excuse, but as the specific, bewildering accounting of how a night that began with laughter ended with flashing lights in a family. In a hospital waiting room and two 18-year-old boys sitting in the back of a patrol car, understanding for the first time in their lives that a joke has a weight to it, and sometimes the weight is heavier than the person who made it can carry. They thought it would be funny. It was not funny. And the person it happened to, a quiet, kind, somewhat awkward 16-year-old named Owen Rafferty, would spend 11 days in a hospital bed and the better part of a year putting himself back together. What Owen did with his anger when he finally came out the other side is the reason this story exists. Before we move forward with the story, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to help us to grow this channel to uplift more people. To understand why Bryce Holden and Damon Fitch thought it would be funny, you have to understand what had been done to them. Bryce was 18, a senior at Millbrook High in a mid-sized town in Tennessee. He was broad and loud in the way of a boy who had learned that taking up a lot of space was the most efficient form of self-protection. He was funny, genuinely, often, with the specific comic timing of someone who had learned early that making people laugh was a way of controlling a room, and controlling a room was a way of being safe in it. He had not always been the one controlling the room. Between the ages of 11 and 14, Bryce had been the target of a different kind of attention. The specific, grinding social cruelty that middle school produces with a particular efficiency directed at him for reasons that were both arbitrary and systematic. The weight he had carried at 11 before a growth spurt redistributed it, the stutter that had plagued him through 7th grade, the family situation that had been visible in the clothes he wore and the lunches he brought. He had been made small, consistently for 3 years. By 14, he had grown and the stutter had faded, and he had remade himself into someone that nobody would think to make small. The mechanism he used was the same mechanism that had been used on him. He never examined that. He had never had a reason to. Damon Fitch was also 18. Bryce's best friend since 9th grade, leaner and quieter, and the kind of person who went along with things. Not from cruelty, not primarily, but from the specific social cowardice of someone who understood on some level that the price of belonging was not asking too many questions about what belonging required. Damon had also been bullied. 6th grade, a different school, a situation involving a group of older boys and a week of targeted cruelty that had resolved on its own when the ringleader moved and had never been discussed with his parents, who had not known, and who would have been devastated to know. He had filed it away. It came out sideways. Together, Bryce and Damon were the kind of pairing that produces a specific dynamic. One who drove and one who followed. One who generated and one who enabled. And between them, a momentum that neither one fully controlled. Owen Rafferty was 16, a junior, 2 years behind Bryce and Damon, which put him in that particular social position of the younger student who is visible to older ones for the wrong reasons. He was quiet. He was the kind of quiet that reads as strange to people who don't know the difference between quiet because something is wrong and quiet because your interior, life is more interesting to you than most of what's happening around you. Owen was the second kind. He drew. Intricate, detailed drawings that filled sketchbooks he kept in his backpack, and that were, to the small number of people who had seen them, genuinely remarkable. He was in the school's art program, and the art teacher, Mr. Avery, had told his parents at the last conference that Owen had a specific kind of talent. He was also, by the social arithmetic of Millbrook High, available. This was the word that applied to the people that Bryce and Damon and their circle found amusing to target. Not dangerous people, not people with the social standing to push back effectively, not people with a network that would produce consequences. Owen had a small friend group, a quiet presence, and a habit of being alone at the picnic tables near the East Building at lunch. He was not a person who had done anything to Bryce or Damon. He was simply there. And he was the kind of there that, to two 18-year-olds with the specific momentum of each other's company and the boredom of a Friday night, seemed like an opportunity. They had planned it the way boys plan things that they think are harmless. Loosely, with laughter. With the specific bravado of people who are not thinking about consequences, because consequences are for the version of the story they have not yet reached. The plan involved Owen's car. Owen had a used sedan, bought with money from a part-time job at a plant nursery, his first car. A source of quiet pride in a life that did not have a lot of external markers of progress. He parked it in the same spot in the school's east lot every day. What Bryce and Damon did to that car was something they had seen referenced in an online video. A modification to the brake system that was, in the video, presented as a visual gag, something that would produce a sound and a scare and nothing more. They did not understand what they were doing. This is important. They did not understand the mechanics of what they were doing. They had watched a 2-minute video. They had laughed at the reaction of the person in the video. They had not understood that there was a significant difference between the way the video's version had been done and the way they were doing it. They did it on a Thursday night. Owen drove to work on Friday morning. He was 3 miles from school when he needed to stop. The police report described the incident with the precise, stripped-down language of official documentation. What that language translated to, in human terms, was this. Owen Rafferty's car had failed to stop at a road junction at a significant speed. The vehicle had left the road, crossed a shallow drainage channel, and come to rest against a low concrete barrier. The airbag had deployed. Owen was unconscious when the first responders arrived. He was airlifted to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. His parents, his father, Glenn, who taught 8th grade science at a different school, and his mother, Patricia, who ran the office of a dental practice, were called at work. They made the drive to Nashville in a state that neither of them would be able to fully reconstruct afterward. The specific experience of driving toward a child who is in a hospital, not knowing the shape of what you are driving toward, is one of the experiences that people do not have adequate language for. Owen was in surgery. The injuries were serious. A broken collarbone, 3 broken ribs, a significant head injury that required the surgery to relieve pressure, and a recovery timeline that the surgeon described with the specific, careful honesty of someone who wants families to hope without promising them more than the situation can support. Glenn and Patricia sat in the waiting room. They sat there for 6 hours. Owen came through. He was in intensive care for 4 days and the hospital for 11. The recovery after discharge was months. The collarbone, the ribs, the head injury that produced headaches and light sensitivity and a difficulty with concentration that affected his ability to draw, which was the thing that made him him, and the loss of which was the most specific cruelty of the recovery. The sketchbook sat on his desk. He could not look at them for weeks. The investigation took 3 days. It found Bryce and Damon through a combination of a security camera at the school parking lot and a conversation between Bryce and a third party, that the third party, when questioned, repeated to authorities. They were brought in on a Sunday evening. They were 18 years old. What they had done under Tennessee law was serious. The legal process that followed, the charges, the attorneys, the court appearances, the ultimate disposition of a case that took 6 months to resolve, was the most significant thing that had happened to either of them in their lives. But before all of that, on the Sunday evening, in the back of the patrol car, before the attorneys and the charges and the weight of the full consequence had arrived, there was a moment. Damon said, to no one specifically, staring at the partition in front of him, "He could have died." Bryce said nothing. Damon said, "He could have died, and we were going to think it was funny." Bryce still said nothing. He was not being stoic. He was not managing himself. He was sitting in the back of a patrol car at 18 years old with his hands in his lap, and the specific total weight of what they had done arriving in a way that no amount of momentum or laughter or bravado could process. He was just a boy who had made something terrible happen and could not unmake it. Owen came home from the hospital on the 12th day. He was not the same. This is not a dramatic statement. It is a physical and neurological fact. The head injury had changed things that were still changing, and the recovery was a process rather than an event. And there were days when the boy who sat in the living room of the house on Caldwell Street bore only partial resemblance to the boy who had driven to work on an ordinary Friday morning. He was angry. The anger was appropriate. It was earned. His parents were angry. His father, Glenn, who was by temperament one of the gentler men in Millbrook, had a specific, cold anger toward Bryce and Damon that he managed in the way of a person who has decided that the managing matters because Owen is watching. Owen watched. He thought about Bryce and Damon, not all the time, but in the specific, intrusive way that the person who has been the subject of someone else's carelessness thinks about those people. He thought about what they had done and why. He thought about what he would say if he saw them. He rehearsed versions of that conversation in the way that people rehearse conversations they may never have. The rehearsed versions were not kind. He was entitled to that. What he did with it eventually was something different. Owen's family attended New Song Seventh-day Adventist Church in Millbrook. They had been members for 7 years. Glenn served as a deacon. Patricia helped coordinate the food ministry. Owen had grown up in the Sabbath school program and had, in the way of teenagers who have grown up in a faith community, a relationship with the church that was more cultural and habitual than examined and personal. The accident changed that. Not immediately. Not with a dramatic single moment. But the specific experience of having nearly not been here, the 11 days in the hospital, the weeks of recovery, the sketchbooks on the desk he could not look at, produced in Owen a quality of attention toward the things that mattered that had not been there before. He came back to church on a Sabbath 6 weeks after his discharge. The pastor, Pastor Nathaniel Ford, 53, a deliberate and honest man who had led New Song for 9 years, noticed Owen in the pew and said nothing during the service and found him in the fellowship hall afterward and said simply, "I am glad you're here." Owen said, "I've been thinking about a lot of things." Pastor Ford said, "What kinds of things?" Owen said, "About what I do with how angry I am." They sat down. Pastor Ford did not offer easy answers. He listened first, to the anger, to the specific things Owen had lost in the recovery, to the sketchbooks, to the rehearsed conversations. He received all of it without abbreviating it or rushing to the resolution. Then he said, "I want to read you a verse, and I want you to hear it, not as an instruction, but as a description of something that is available to you. You don't have to take it right now, you just have to hear it." He read Ephesians 4:32. "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." He said, the verse doesn't say forgive because they deserve it. It doesn't say forgive because what they did wasn't serious. It doesn't say forgive because the anger isn't legitimate. He paused. It says forgive as God forgave you. The measure of the forgiveness is not the worthiness of the person receiving it. It is the character of the God who modeled it. He looked at Owen. Forgiveness is not for them. It's for you. The anger you're carrying is yours to carry. It doesn't hurt Bryce and Damon. It lives in you. Owen was quiet. He said, "I don't know if I can." Pastor Ford said, "You can't. Not on your own. That's why the verse says, just as in Christ. It's not asking you to produce this from your own reserves. It's asking you to let something flow through you that is larger than what you have." Owen went home. He sat with the verse for 3 weeks. 4 months after the accident, Owen Rafferty wrote a letter. He wrote it to Bryce and Damon together. Not 2 separate letters, one letter addressed to both of them, because what had happened had been a shared thing, and the letter was a shared thing. He wrote for a long time. He threw away 3 drafts, not because they were too angry, but because they were too managed. The 4th draft was plain. He told them what the recovery had been like. Not to punish them with the details. He was specific about that in the letter itself. He said he was not telling them to hurt them, but because they should know what they had done in full. He told them about the sketchbooks on the desk. He told them about the headaches and the light sensitivity and the day he tried to draw for the first time and could not make his hand do what his mind asked. Then he told them he was choosing to forgive them. Not that he was there yet. Not that the anger was gone. He told them he was choosing, with everything in him, to walk toward forgiveness, because a pastor had told him that forgiveness was not for them. It was for him. And because he did not want to spend his life carrying what they had put in him. He said, at the end of the letter, "I don't know what your lives look like. I don't know what made you think this was something you could do, but I know that whatever was broken in you that let you do this, it was broken before you did it to me. And I'm praying for you, not as a performance. Actually praying because I think that's what I'm supposed to do, and I think it might be the thing that helps both of us." He sealed the letter shrugged. He gave it to his father to deliver. Glenn Rafferty drove to the address. He rang the bell. He handed it to Bryce's mother, who looked at the envelope and looked at Glenn and could not speak for a moment. Glenn said, "It's from Owen. He wrote it himself." He drove home. Bryce and Damon received the letter on a Tuesday. They read it separately and then, because they were still, despite everything, the pairing they had always been, they read it again together in Bryce's car in a parking lot. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Damon said finally, "He's praying for us." Bryce said, "I know." Damon said, "After what we did." Bryce said nothing. He was looking at the letter, specifically at the line about the sketchbooks on the desk. About the day Owen tried to draw and couldn't make his hand do what his mind asked. He said, "We have to do something." The something took 4 weeks to figure out and 6 weeks to execute. A restitution fund. organized with the help of their attorneys as part of the legal resolution, but going beyond what the legal process required. It covered the medical costs the family's insurance had not covered. It was not enough. They knew it was not enough. They did it anyway. They also separately sought help. Bryce went to a counselor. He talked about the 3 years in middle school. He talked about the thing the cruelty had installed in him and the way it had come out sideways. He talked for a long time about a letter written by a boy he had put in the hospital who was praying for him. Damon did something that surprised even Bryce. He went to New Song Seventh-day Adventist Church on a Sabbath morning. He did not call ahead. He did not tell anyone he was coming. He sat in the back and he listened to Pastor Nathaniel Ford preach. And afterward he stayed, sitting in the empty pew, until Pastor Ford noticed him and came back. Damon said, "I'm one of the ones who did it," to Owen. "I'm one of the ones he forgave." Pastor Ford sat down. He said, "I know who you are." Damon said, "How do you—" "Owen told me about the letter," Pastor Ford said. "He told me he was praying for you." Damon looked at the front of the sanctuary. He said, "Why would he do that?" Pastor Ford said, "Because someone showed him that the measure of forgiveness is not the worthiness of the person receiving it. It's the character of the person giving it." He looked at Damon, and Owen has a very good character. Damon sat in New Song Seventh-day Adventist Church for a long time. He came back the following Sabbath, and the one after that. Owen found out 3 months later. Pastor Ford asked his permission before telling him, which was a pastoral instinct that Owen appreciated more than he could say. Owen did not immediately know what to do with the information. He sat with it. Then, on a Sabbath morning in November, almost a year after the accident, when the headaches had largely faded and the light sensitivity had eased and the sketchbooks were open again and the drawings were coming back, different from before but still his, Owen walked up to Damon in the fellowship hall at New Song. Damon saw him coming. He had the specific, braced expression of someone who is not certain what they are about to receive. Owen extended his hand. He said, "I'm Owen." Damon shook it. He said, "I know who you are." Owen said, "I know you do." A pause. "I'm glad you came." Damon looked at him. He said, "Why?" Owen said, "Because the same thing that helped me is available to you, and you look like you need it." It was not the conversation either of them had imagined, but it was the right one. Ephesians 4:32 is a verse that costs something. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. The model Paul gives is not a human model. He does not say, "Bandie, forgive the way good people forgive," or forgive the way emotionally mature people forgive, or forgive when you feel ready to forgive. He says, "Forgive as in Christ God forgave you." The standard is the cross, where forgiveness was extended before the recipient deserved it, before the recipient had changed, before the cost had been fully paid. Extended anyway, because that is the character of the one doing the forgiving. This is not easy. Owen Rafferty would be the first to tell you it was not easy. The anger was legitimate. The injury was real. The sketchbooks on the desk were real. The months of headaches were real. Forgiveness did not make those things not real. It made them not the last word. This story also carries a truth about the origin of cruelty. Bryce and Damon were not born the way they became. They were shaped by specific experiences, by what was done to them, by the crooked road that turns a wounded child into someone who wounds others. That is not absolution. They made choices. Adults make choices and own them. But understanding the shape of the wound matters, not to excuse, but to interrupt. The cycle ends when someone looks at what was done to them and decides, consciously, not to pass it on. Owen interrupted the cycle by forgiving. Bryce interrupted it by getting help. Damon interrupted it by walking through a door. 3 different responses to the same broken thing. All of them necessary, none of them easy. And the drawing that came back, different from before but still his, is the right image for what restoration actually looks like. Not a return to before, something new, shaped by what was survived, still recognizably the thing it was made to be. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 4:32. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to be notified about more inspirational stories on redemption and hope.